Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming in from the sunshine for even more intense illumination, which you'll enjoy in here. It's my very great pleasure and honour to introduce Professor Colin McGinn, who is our speaker tonight, talking about Mysterianism and the mind of God. Colin's interests in philosophy include a huge range: philosophy of mind, metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of language, ethics, philosophy of physics, the philosophy of literature and film. He's taught at many universities, including Rutgers, Oxford University, University College London, and he's published over 20 books. I got huge pleasure and illumination out of, for example, The Subjective View, The Character of Mind, early books which certainly helped to convert me from my materialist monism, which I had fallen victim to for a period of my life. In addition to that, he's written novels, and he's written a fantastic memoir called The Making of a Philosopher, and it's very interesting and also very funny at times. Anyway, he is clearly a polymath within the field of philosophy and beyond. And it's interesting, his title, Mysterianism, is an example of how you embrace, as it were, a jeer that's thrown at you and turn it into a badge of honor. I think it was Owen Flanagan that described Colin as a Mysterian, for reasons that may well become a Mysterianist Mysterian, because he wrote a particular paper in Mind, which he may well refer to, and that, as it were, term of dishonor was embraced by him, a bit like the Impressionists. You know, they were dismissed as Impressionists, but they wore it as a badge of honor. Anyway, an extraordinarily interesting philosopher, and somebody who I know will have something of great interest to tell us. In addition, he will be responded to initially by Roger Scruton, and you will all know him, either if not before this present meeting, will have known him from his contributions and from the introduction he's had. But let me reiterate the introduction for those of you who may not have been present at his previous presentation. He is an extraordinary person who he's a primary philosopher, visiting professor in the School of Philosophical, Anthropological and Film Studies at the University of St Andrews, and a visiting professor of philosophy at University of Oxford. He's a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington and a contributing editor to the New Atlantis. His range of books and his number of his books is absolutely astonishing. But his most recent ones, just to give you some idea of the scope, are Our Church, A Personal History of the Church of England, Beauty, a very short introduction, The Uses of Pessimism, and Green Philosophy. I think I mentioned this yesterday, or whenever it was that I introduced him, that he is a truly public intellectual, and the very fact he's become very public doesn't mean to say he's become any less intellectual. He absolutely hasn't. And although he's been extraordinarily prolific, he's somehow managed to escape the trade-off between quality and depth. His books are both numerous and extraordinarily profound. So you've got a great team tonight, and Colin's going to kick off talking about Mysterianism and the mind of God. Colin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ray, for that introduction, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me. I left Oxford in 1989. I moved to the United States, and this is the first time I've been back in that 25-year period. I won't give you my reflections on that, but you can think about it yourself. Okay, so I'm just going to read my paper in a good old-fashioned way. A typical university education in the science of psychology, which I myself had, will include a course entitled Comparative Psychology, which deals with animal psychology and its similarities to and differences from human psychology. But I've never heard of a psychology degree that offers a comparative psychology course on divine psychology and its relation to human and animal psychology. Yet, God must have a psychology because he has a mind, and there must be a philosophy of mind appropriate to the divine mind as well. God has various mental faculties, and these must have a nature and a modus operandi. So why can't we study the mind of God? Why do we find this gap in the curriculum? It can hardly be that the subject is deemed unacceptably impious, because theology studies God in all sorts of ways. So can't he be studied psychologically? If we are allowed to discuss God's plans and intentions, then he must have plans and intentions, and then we can ask theoretical questions about these divine mental attributes. Any being with states of mind must have a psychology in which these states feature. It might be said that God certainly has a psychology, but that we cannot hope to study it, because we can't do experiments on God or observe its behavior. We cannot therefore have a proper empirical science of God's mind. It is no doubt true that we can't use God as an experimental subject, along with the usual herd of conscripted undergraduate subjects, because of his, what shall we say, general unavailability. But it's wrong to conclude from this that we cannot meaningfully investigate God's mind. We cannot perform experiments on Shakespeare either, or any other dead person. And that doesn't mean that we cannot make justified statements about the mind of Shakespeare. Why? Because we know quite a lot about Shakespeare's mind from the evidence of it he left behind. Of this we can make reasonable inferences. Experimental evidence is not the only kind of psychological evidence that there is. So we might have enough information about God that we can make sensible inferences about the nature of his mind. The right thing to do is look and see whether we do have adequate evidence of what it tells us. Another objection to the project of divine psychology might be made. We cannot have a psychological theory of God's mind because God does not exist. It would be like having a comparative psychology, in the usual sense, that included the unicorn, a non-existent beast with a non-existent mind. But this is a bad argument. We can ask about the mind of Sherlock Holmes without presupposing that he exists. Fictional characters have minds too, and hence psychologies. Thus, we know that Holmes has a very high IQ, is easily bored, and is subject to narcotic cravings. We also know that he has a language faculty, and hence must have acquired language during childhood, with all the psychological machinery that implies. So, even if God is merely a fictional character with no existence, we can still ask what kind of psychology he has. The evidence for this will come from human intentionality, how God has been depicted and conceived in various traditions of religious thought. God must have a psychology that is such that those depictions could be true, just as with Sherlock Holmes and other fictional characters. If God exists, on the other hand, then his mind also exists, and hence has an existent nature, which can in principle be investigated. Our knowledge here can only be tentative, to be sure, but that's true of large tracts of human knowledge in general. There are many things we can know something about without supposing that we can acquire certainty or knowledge of the deep principles of whatever our subject is. So, there seems to me no objection of principle, methodologically, to pursuing the subject of divine psychology, though it might prove arduous and elusive. Our approach will naturally be comparative. How does divine psychology compare to human psychology? I'll be unavoidably sketchy about this in what follows, but I think the outlines of the divine mind are fairly clear, perhaps surprisingly. 2 points are obvious at the outset. God thinks, and he has mastery of language. Just as we are essentially thinking beings, as Descartes claimed, so God is essentially a thinking being. This means that God thinks logically. His thoughts are governed by relations of logical validity. If so, his thoughts must have propositional content, there being no other kind of logical thought. We must ascribe thoughts to him using what philosophers call that clauses. God thinks, for instance, that man is weak and easily led. God reasons according to modus ponens and other logical rules which concern propositions. In this he resembles humans, cognitively speaking, but his propositional thought differs in one important way, perhaps others, from that of humans. His thought does not generate what philosophers call opaque contexts on account of his omniscience. A human can believe that Hesperus is a planet without believing that Phosphorus is a planet, even though Hesperus is identical to Phosphorus, it's Venus, because he or she doesn't realize that the identity holds. That crucial piece of knowledge is missing. This is a point that Frege, of course, made famous. But God knows everything, necessarily so, and therefore he cannot fail to know the truth of all identity statements. So all ascriptions to God of singular thoughts, when you ascribe using, say, a proper name, will produce only transparent contexts, in which code-denoting names are intersubstitutable. God's thoughts no doubt have sense and reference, as Frege argued, but God recognizes the referential coincidence of all senses that in fact have the same reference. Given that God thinks in propositions, various other things follow, very familiar to philosophers. The thoughts of God will have logical form, possibly that specified by standard predicate logic, whatever you think the best account of logical form is. When God has a descriptive thought, say, the Queen of England has been a good monarch, his thought will have the logical form captured in Russell's theory of descriptions, which is the best theory of descriptions. And according to that theory, it has the form of a quantified conjunction. We needn't worry about the details of that. His general thoughts will have the structure specified in Frege's account of quantification, since this will conform to, since this will by common consent, this is by common consent the correct theory of generality. It's usually hailed as a great discovery about the nature of generality. His adverbial thoughts will conform to Davidson's theory of adverbs, or whatever is the best theory of adverbs. The content of God's thoughts will include particular objects, and not merely general concepts, granted the correctness of what are called direct reference theories of thought. These theories are not held to be merely contingently true of humans, but to apply to all beings capable of the thoughts in question, their logical theories, and hence to God's thoughts. God's evident mastery of language, quote, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, so we know that God has mastery of language, will also imply various theses about his psychology. As we know from Chomsky and others, language is a recursive structure based on a finite vocabulary with finitely many grammatical rules. God's language, maybe it's mainly a language of thought, not much used for communication, I'm not sure who God talks to most of the time, may not share the precise rules and vocabulary of human languages, but it must still exhibit syntactic and semantic structure. It must be compositional, generative, and imbued with grammatical rules. It cannot be systematically ungrammatical, that would be extremely strange. It must be based on rules that produce sense, not nonsense. Thus, God's language faculty has a structure very similar to the human language faculty, at least at an abstract level. That is, a finitely based recursive system of normative rules. Much the same is true of his cognitive capacity. His thoughts, too, must result from rule-governed combinations of conceptual elements. We can therefore say that this aspect of God's mind has the architecture of systems with what is called discrete infinity. Words and concepts are simple, discrete entities that can combine into infinitely many complex sentences or thoughts. This is the point that Chomsky often makes about the nature of human language mastery, that involves discrete infinity as opposed to continuous infinity. I would say that this kind of cognitive architecture also applies to God's geometrical and social modes of cognition. In both cases, we have primitive elements, shapes in individual people, in the two cases, that combine into novel complexes according to fixed rules. When God thinks about human beings in groups, say, his thoughts exhibit the same abstract schematism. He represents us as a social formation made up of individuals that may combine in all sorts of ways and with certain sorts of outcome. How else could he think about entities that exhibit the combinatorial character we find in social groups? And the same holds for his geometric representations of the world. I think we can also confidently assert that God is conscious. There is something it's like to be him in the famous phrase, even if we cannot grasp it, like those bats that have been written about so much. They have a consciousness, but we don't know what it's like to be them. Well, God is similarly conscious, but we don't know, at least fully, what it's like to be God. On some views, this implies that God harbours qualia in his mind. On other views, every divine conscious state must exhibit intentionality, this being the mark of the mental. That was Brentano's position. God, not Brentano, must also be self-conscious, much like us. And he must have a self, not just be, say, a mere bundle of sensations. His consciousness must be unified and centered. He must refer to himself with the first person pronoun I, and ascribe conscious state to the self thus referred to, and incorrigibly so, as we do. These thoughts will have the features of all such thoughts, involving immunity to error through misidentification, as well as something like David Kaplan's distinction between character and content. If you don't know about that, it doesn't really matter, but for the philosophers, maybe they'll know what I'm saying. For these are all logical features of I and apply to any user of that word. One respect in which the consciousness of God differs from our consciousness and that of animals is that there is no mind-body problem for God. To where the Mysterianism comes into my discussion. This is simply because he has neither body nor brain. There is, therefore, no mystery in God's nature stemming from that problem. We don't face a deep puzzle about how the consciousness of God could result from neural activity in God's brain. God's consciousness, unlike ours, did not emerge from brain activity. How it does come about is another question, but it certainly does not arise from electrochemical activity in a divine brain. In this respect, then, God's consciousness is rather less mysterious than ours. It's true that some philosophers have argued that the notion of a disembodied consciousness is not coherent, but the idea of an embodied consciousness also has its deep mysteries, which we instantiate, but God doesn't. God exhibits no mysterious psychophysical link or dependence. God also possesses a will. He decides, has practical reason, and he deliberates. But is his will free? Everyone knows what a problem this is in the case of humans. The only thing I wish to say about this problem here is that the problem applies equally to God, if it applies to us. Freedom seems to be compatible with neither determinism nor indeterminism, but these exhaust the possibilities, so it appears, and so the will is not free. But God's decisions are subject to the same dilemma, even if he is not constrained by the physical world. If his acts of will are caused, they cannot be free, by the classic argument, but they cannot be free if not caused either, then they'll just be random. There are, of course, many attempts to get around this argument. It's just a classic argument against free will, which I can't discuss here, and I have a view myself about that. But I think it's fair to report that none of these views are free of difficulty or there's any consensus about them. In any case, free or not, God has a will. He's not purely contemplative or passive. Given that God has a will, he must also have desires and wishes, not for food and sex to be sure, but for peace, harmony, and goodness. When God acts, he acts for reasons, and these reasons comprise beliefs and desires in the usual bipartite way. If God sent his Son into the world in order to be our salvation, then he must have desired our salvation and believed that sending his Son into the world, that by sending his Son into the world, he could satisfy that desire. So God has a belief, desire, practical psychology. He has desires for certain ends and beliefs about the means for achieving these ends, and he forms intentions by combining these desires and beliefs in them. Must be roughly the same way that we do. Maybe he even has degrees of desire as we do, so that these psychological states are subject to continuous magnitudes, as when we speak of having a strong desire for, say, immortality, or a beer. It doesn't have to be anything grand. Then God's mind would be discrete in some ways, that is, with words and concepts, and continuous in others, say, with degrees of desire, just like ours, in fact, but with a rather different desire set. Presumably God does not work with subjective probabilities in his practical reasoning. Given his omniscience, he doesn't have to reckon with ignorance about what's going to happen. But he still functions according to standard belief desire psychology, since he acts for reasons. Nor, presumably, does God have needs, as we do, despite the existence of divine desires. That would suggest a vulnerability alien to God's nature. He does not need us to be virtuous, though he doubtless wishes it was so. I don't think that God has an unconscious or that he dreams. He certainly does not have a Freudian unconscious, and I doubt, in fact, that humans do, but that's another matter. But he also lacks the kind of cognitive unconscious that modern psychology attributes to humans. There's no subconscious information processing going on in God, so as to save on the amount of conscious space being taken up. God has no computational limitations in his consciousness. In God's mind, all is at the forefront of consciousness. As to dreaming, God never sleeps, so he has no opportunity to dream. And what would he dream about? His anxieties and repressed feelings? Hardly. Nor I conjecture does God daydream, letting his mind wander where it will. I wonder whether he has any imagination at all, as opposed to apprehension and reason. Does he have mental images? In what sense modality would he have them, since he doesn't usually is supposed to have senses? God's mind may be considerably larger than ours, but it's also in certain respects simpler. There's much discussion as to how much of human knowledge is innate. No one doubts that we learn and acquire knowledge, so that not everything is innate, even if much knowledge may be. But God never learns anything. He certainly does not get his ideas from the world outside his mind by employing his senses, as the empiricists supposed. He is omniscient and always has been. There was no ignorant childhood there. Thus, all his knowledge is innate. It all comes from within his own being, never being derived from what enters through his senses. Empiricism is false for God's knowledge, even if it is true for a good deal of human knowledge. Descartes thought that our innate knowledge was planted in us by God, but he would presumably not say the same about God's innate knowledge. God, did not plant it in himself, for where did he get the knowledge to plant? He would have already had to have it. He must have it already. So God's knowledge belongs to him natively and eternally. He innately knows everything there is to know, assuming, of course, divine foreknowledge. Mathematics, logic, metaphysics, ethics, and language, this is all innate for God. And the same must be true for history, geography, cooking, and so forth, at least given his general omniscience. I've said nothing so far about God's personality. The tradition sometimes ventures an opinion on this, at least some strands in it do, describing God as jealous and vengeful or kindly and forgiving. Certainly, God is rightly described as a person with the attributes that define personhood: self-awareness, identity over time, reason, and so forth. But it doesn't follow that he has a personality. And I find myself doubting this idea. It smacks to me of anthropomorphism. Does it not? I hope it does to you. Do we really want to entertain the possibility that God is short-tempered, or soft-hearted, or gloomy, or cheerful, or extroverted, or introverted? The concept of personality seems not to fit the mind of God as we grasp it. The same might be said of some animals that have minds. You can have a mind, even quite a sophisticated one, and yet have no personality at all, in the usual sense. Do sheep have personalities, or snakes, or fish? Similarly, I don't think God has a personality, despite his manifest personhood. He has different desires from, say, the devil, but that's not enough to ground the ordinary notion of personality, with its implication of quirks and arbitrariness of traits. That seems far too limiting, far too human. It would be odd to describe God as having a sparkling personality, or being a bit of an introvert. That's the usual ways we talk about personality. Even from this quick survey, I think we can see that the project of divine psychology can lead some non-trivial results. We can know quite a bit about the mind of God, just by deductions, really, even if not everything. But that limitation is true of our knowledge of the minds of terrestrial animals. We don't know everything about them, we know a certain amount. I doubt that university departments of psychology would give research money to a project on divine psychology, but it does seem to be a possible enterprise. It could be a branch of theology, perhaps. Let's call it theological psychology or psychological theology. I now want to discuss the question of the relationship between God and the world. I'm homing in on the general theme of this conference, but I wanted to give you the earlier material because I enjoyed thinking about it myself. So we're going to talk about the relationship between God and the world, and now it's going to get a little bit more analytically philosophical. For the sake of argument, let us suppose God to exist and the world to exist. Both existential claims could, of course, be coherently denied. By the world, I just mean all of spatio-temporal reality, including the minds of humans and animals. The point I wish to make is that the God-world relationship can be usefully articulated by invoking some ideas drawn from the philosophy of mind. This will act as a prelude to discussing the question of God's intervention in the world, for that question presupposes an understanding of the metaphysical relation between the two. Again, I will perforce be sketchy. One view would be that God and the world are totally separate substances. Call the world empirical substance, and call God divine substance. Then this view would be a dualism of empirical and divine substances. Such a position is modelled on the Cartesian conception of mind and body, a pair of independent substances existing alongside one another. God could exist without the world, as Descartes would think that the mind can exist without the body. And perhaps the world could exist without God. Depends on your theology. Say if God decided to end his being and leave the world intact. The two separate substances might be taken to interact or not, depending on one's metaphysical opinions. And there are different views about the mind and body about that question of interaction. Leibniz had one view, Descartes another. Let's suppose that they do interact, with God intervening in the course of history. There would then be a problem about how this interaction takes place, analogous to Descartes' problem of interaction between mind and body. If the divine substance is non-spatial, then the problem will coincide with Descartes' problem, since mind is a non-spatial substance for him. The proponent of this interactionist dualism between God and the universe might propose, parodying Descartes, a galactic thyroid gland, and I'm sure it would be the Earth, because it's our favourite planet. That would be the locus of interaction. But of course, as everybody knows, that would be no better than Descartes' own solution to the problem of interaction. Leaves the problem exactly where it was, and how does the mind interact with the thyroid gland. Still got the problem of the extended substance and the unextended substance interacting causally. Thus, God-world substantial dualism has an interaction problem. It therefore seems that God will become, is in danger of becoming at least epiphenomenal with respect to the world, which is not a happy result theologically as to what happens with dualism of mind and body. It's hard to explain why the mind has any causal role in producing actions. Then there is the view that God and world coincide in some way, the exact opposite of Descartes. One might here think of Spinoza's doctrine, according to which God and the world are one. This view is analogous to the identity theory of mind and brain, not two things but one, described in two different ways. Here we solve the problem of interaction, since we're dealing with just one spatial substance which obeys the usual causal rules. God can cause events in the world because he is the world. Parts of him are causing other parts of him, in effect. The trouble with this view is its extreme reductionism, which is tantamount to eliminativism, hence the accusation of atheism against Spinoza. If God is really nothing over and above the world, then it's hard to see what is added to the world by his existence. There may as well be no God at all. Same if the mind is nothing over and above the brain, why do we even bother to talk about the mind? The remaining views in this philosophical subject of the mind-body problem try to avoid this rather awkward scilla and charybdis of dualism and monism with greater or lesser success. Thus we might try the idea that God emerges from the world and is yet something over and above the world. This view is modelled on the emergentist view of mind and brain. The mind necessarily emerges from the brain, but what emerges is a new level of reality, not reducible to its basis in the brain. Such a position is theologically problematic, clearly, because it's hard to see how God could emerge from the world and yet be its creator. The creation relation has been inverted if we become emergentist about the existence of God. But it's also metaphysically troubling, because the notion of emergence is mysterious and seemingly miraculous. How can X owe its very being to Y and nothing but Y, and yet be something over and above Y? It's also not clear how this solves the interaction problem, once God has been granted separate ontological status as an emergent entity. We seem to be being offered, in effect, some sort of dual aspect view, or what's called property dualism. And then there is a question how the extra aspect can fit into the causal order. Can't we explain everything at the Y level in terms of the Y aspect, with the X aspect being merely epiphenomenal? Panpsychism is now ventured. In philosophy of mind, it's become a very popular view, panpsychism, these days. The mind is already part of the physical world, but in small packets, so that the emergence of mind from matter is not really radical and miraculous. Atoms, according to this view, have tiny bits of consciousness in them, so when they combine, bigger conscious bits result. So that's how you explain emergentism. How did mind emerge from matter? Well, there was already bits of mind in matter. Pantheism is the analogous doctrine with regard to God. There are bits of divine dust scattered everywhere in the world, and God himself is just their universal summation. Lots of little gods get together to produce one big God, as it were. You can tell I don't think much of panpsychism. Thus, the emergence of the divine from the empirical is explained because all the empirical has bits of divinity in it to start with. Again, there are clear theological problems with this picture with respect to creation, but we also have problems about how the combination works, as well as, of course, as the sheer implausibility of the position. What exactly are these microscopic hidden gods lurking everywhere, just itching to combine into one big macroscopic God? Not a very attractive metaphysical view. Lastly, we have idealism, and we always have to, in any lists of all these issues, idealism always comes at the end because it isn't a popular view these days. Berkeley held that the so-called material world consists of ideas in the mind of God, so that the world, what I'm calling the world, well, the space and time, is really not separate from God at all. There is in in Berkeley's view, only spiritual substance, and I'm sure most of you know that there were two substances, two kinds of spiritual substance, the infinite one, which was God, and the finite ones, which were human minds. Thus, there was no problem of interaction between substances with different essences, since for Berkeley there is no material substance. This is analogous to holding that the brain is nothing but the mind, with mind as the basic substance of reality. According to idealism, God never created a material universe at all, though he did create a universe that exists when we do not perceive it, since it always exists in God's mind. You always have to be careful, of course, in Berkeley. He denies that there's a material universe. He doesn't deny that there are external objects. He just thinks that their nature is to be ideas in the mind of God and not material things. He thinks that there are no material things, that he thinks it's a nonsensical notion. All causation in Berkeley's system is really mental causation, which he thought was intelligible, and he didn't think physical causation was, on this view. So it all takes place within the one infinite spiritual substance, which is God. Matter, for him, is a myth invented by misguided philosophers. What we really have are ideas subsisting in the human mind, as well, of course, as in the divine mind, as well, of course, as in the human mind. None of these various views which I've gone over, it's a bit Philosophy 101, I'm sure, are free of difficulty, to put it mildly, either in relation to the mind or to God. There is here a real problem of metaphysical integration. This means that the problem of God-world integration is not in itself a reason to reject the existence of God, any more than the analogous problem about mind and body is a reason to reject mind. So some people have thought that the existence of this integration problem is a reason to be an eliminativist, as somebody who denies the existence of mind. That's a view that's been taken. Somebody might take that view. They might say about the case of the God-world relationship, well, the difficulty of explaining, difficulty of integrating the two is a reason to suppose that there is no God, or that there's no world. You can go either way. But I take it a much more sober and reasonable position is that just because of this metaphysical problem, that is not in itself a sufficient reason to deny the existence of the mind or the existence of God. In both cases, the dualist position is the one is most immediately attractive. It might even claim to be the common sense position, but it encounters serious difficulties concerning causal interaction. The other positions are attempts to resolve the interaction problem, but they suffer their own drawbacks. This is philosophy at its hardest. In fact, that's why it's called philosophy, because these questions are hard in that way. That's really just a framework for thinking about the God-world relationship, which, as I say, is a preliminary to trying to understand what divine intervention might be at a metaphysical level. How does this bear on the question of divine intervention? Let me distinguish two problems, one about interaction, the other about determinism. If we presuppose a radical dualism of God and the world, then we get an interaction problem, analogous to Descartes' problem. How can God make causal contact with the spatial world, given that he is not spatial? This is indeed a problem. I'm not saying there are no possible answers, it's a well-known philosophical problem, as it was for Descartes. We either have to declare ineradicable mystery about the relationship, or we have to dilute the dualism somehow, because if it's a radical dualism, we run into this interaction problem. But the problem is not peculiar to God's supposed intervention in the world, this problem of interaction, since it applies to mind-body dualism. In fact, there is an analogous problem concerning our knowledge of mathematics, which the philosopher Paul Manasaraf made famous. How can we know about numbers, given that numbers are Platonic entities existing outside of space and time? These are all philosophical problems of interaction and causality and so forth. But the God case is not unique. It's not uniquely problematic in generating this type of problem. So I think theologians can take some comfort in that fact. They can say, well, there are other problems which are difficult too. It's not just this one. With respect to determinism, the problem is how it can be that God can intervene in the course of history, given that nature is governed by inviolable natural laws. Aren't all his decisions impotent to change the course of history, with the basic laws determining everything that happens, the laws of physics? How can God hope to affect what happens in nature, when nature operates by laws independently of his will, assuming that those laws do operate independently of his will? There are, of course, views according to which that's not so. So I'm interested in the question of that some particularly scientists have who are theists, the problem of trying to reconcile the universality of natural law with the possibility of God acting in the world. That's the focus in my interest in this. Again, I think this is a genuine philosophical problem, but it's worth observing that it applies to human decisions too. How can what we decide make any difference to the course of history, given that history is determined by laws of nature and initial conditions? How can there be what's called downward causation from will to world? The human will looks to be epiphenomenal, with all the causal work being done by factors outside of its operations, physical factors in the nervous system, obviously. How then is it possible for humans to intervene in nature? If we could just identify acts of will with underlying physical mechanisms in the brain, ultimately just configurations of atoms and so on, then we would not have a problem, because then decisions would be physical events in the basic causal order. But this seems too reductive, just as the analogous position with respect to God's role in history would be too reductive, as it might be the view that God's will is just an attribute of atoms, say electromagnetism. And you could maintain that view, and then of course you'd find a causal role for God's will, but that's an incredibly reductive view about God's will, right? Reduce it to electromagnetism, electrical attractions and so forth. Thus we are sent on a search for some position that avoids the problems identified so far, with nothing that we find proving completely satisfactory. So I've said that there are these two very analogous, in fact I think identical problems about human will and divine will, the human will in relation to the human body and bodily movements, and divine will in relation to events in the spatio-temporal universe. So both these problems actually have to do with things which are mental on one side, and on the other side things which are, well, let's say physical. But notice that the problem is not confined to the psychological level. How can biological events, such as acts of reproduction, influence the course of history, given that physical determinism holds? Somebody might wonder. Isn't everything fixed by the state of elementary particles already, so that we have no need of extra biological events to explain what happens? It can all be explained by physics. But then, the conclusion appears to be that animal copulation would play no role in determining what happens, which sounds wrong, right? It does. What we need is a way to reconcile downward causation with physical determinism, or with indeterminism if nature is fundamentally indeterministic. The issue is really not about determinism as such, it's about the nature of the fundamental physical laws, whether they're deterministic or indeterministic. This is indeed a genuine philosophical question to which various answers have been proposed. My point is just that the problem about God's intervention just appears to be a special case of this more general problem, and is therefore not in itself a reason for theological anxiety. How can animal action intervene in the causal order if it's governed from the ground up? If the causal order is governed from the ground up by physics, how can divine action intervene in the causal order if it is governed by physics from the ground up? It seems to be essentially the same problem. We surely don't want to accept that God or animals need to thwart the laws of physics in order to have an influence on what happens, in order for any of us to have an influence on what happens. We don't suppose that whenever we act, we're thwarting the laws of physics. That would be crazy. But then it seems that all the causation in the universe proceeds purely from atoms and their states. As I say, this is a real philosophical puzzle. My point is just that it's a general puzzle about causation and the entities that populate the universe and whose antics make a difference to what happens. It's not clear that the problem of divine intervention, as I've formulated it so far, adds anything new or unique to that very general problem. As to the very different idea that God can intervene in nature in such a way as to disrupt its laws, I hold, I'm just stating my view, to the orthodox secular opinion that no such thing has ever occurred. There is, I think, simply no convincing evidence that such a miracle, in one sense of that word, has ever been observed. I'm not trying to prove that to you, I'm just saying that that's my view, and I think that's a view that many people have, but they aren't seriously worried about the question of divine action in a world in which there are no contraventions of the laws of physics. In fact, when they think there's a problem because those laws are inviolable. What's commonly cited, in my view, as evidence for these things is just so much questionable testimony. Whether or not Hume's classic argument applies is another matter. I do not think Hume's argument is a very convincing one, because it seems to me to confuse a metaphysical question with an epistemological question. I'm making this aside about this argument of Hume's because I know people wanted to talk about it a lot at this conference, so I'll say my little bit of spiel about it. The question is, could there be miracles? That's a metaphysical question. Hume's argument has to do with, could I ever have rational grounds for believing that there are miracles? That's a totally different question, right? And Hume's principle, the idea that, first of all, Hume limits it to, could I have rational grounds based on people's testimony, That's not the only evidence there ever could be, right? If we went out and we saw in the sky, writing in the sky, and there was a voice booming out, that would be, it's not testimony. I would be quite convinced by that if I saw it. Hume, and there are other things wrong with Hume's argument. It depends on how good the testimony is. It depends who the people are giving the testimony. It depends on the prime probability of the thing. It's not Hume's argument is a decent rule of thumb for practical context. It's not a principle you can apply universally and without exception. I think it's wrong. And more fundamentally, what's wrong with it is, as I said, it confuses a metaphysical question, could there be miracles, with could I have rational grounds for believing there could be miracles? Maybe it's true, I could never have rational grounds for believing there could be miracles. It does not follow from that there could not be miracles. Right? Just totally different questions. But Hume, like many philosophers in our tradition, had a rooted tendency to conflate metaphysical with epistemological questions. Anyway, that's a little bit about that. The kind of event that would constitute such a breach of natural laws, in this sense of miracle, and of course there are many ideas of miracle you can have, would be, for instance, the suspension of the law of gravity as someone is plummeting to earth, resulting in their ceasing to fall and floating in thin air. The forces of nature would need to be countermanded by God for this to happen. Even if God has such a power, conferred by his omnipotence, and if he's omnipotent, of course he has that power, I don't believe he's ever exercised it. I just don't think there's any convincing evidence for that. And the idea that he does it sparingly and sporadically for especially good ends obviously raises the question of why he doesn't do it more often. By contrast, the question of the compatibility of divine intervention and the unbroken existence of natural laws raises a genuine and unavoidable puzzle, not dependent on empirical issues about whether there's any good evidence for contraventions of the law of nature and so on. But, as I've said, this puzzle is not confined to God's action in the world. As a final remark, let me just say that a radically dualist view of the relationship between God and the universe is apt to make the problem of intervention more difficult than under other metaphysical conceptions. It's the same with Descartes' dualism. Radical separation makes the mind cut off from the causal network in a way that it is intuitively not cut off from. We need to find a closer relationship than this if the causal picture is to work. Philosophers have toyed with notions like realization as a way to characterize the relationship between the mental level and the physical level, so that the levels are close enough to make causal sense. The idea is that a belief, say, is realized by a brain state. It's the idea. Well, I'll explain it in a second. If you don't know, if you're not familiar with it. The model here would be, say, the way an eye is realized, an eye, E-Y-E, is realized in different anatomical organs. Being an eye is not identical to any one anatomical type of eye, yet we can say that eyes are realized by different anatomical types. If we take our lead from this example, if we do, we could try saying that God is realized by the universe, is in some way embodied, in inverted commas, by the spatio-temporal universe, without being reducible to the universe. He has no further substance over and above that of the universe, but he is not simply identical to the universe. It's a bit like the way, another well-known philosophical conundrum, the way a statue is realized in a particular chunk of bronze without being nothing but a chunk of bronze. There's an easy proof that you can't identify the statue with the chunk of bronze, and yet they're obviously in a very close relationship to each other. I am not sure I know what this idea of realization comes to. In fact, I'm sure I don't know what it comes to for the case of God and the universe. But at least it promises to make it possible for God to be enmeshed in the natural causal order without collapsing into it, as in the naive Spinozistic view I mentioned earlier. It's not so much that God intervenes on this view as supervenes, to use the jargon. On this view, there would be a mega-universe that includes both the physical universe and God, with the two locked inextricably together somehow. But trying to make metaphysical and theological sense of this is a very tall order, to put it mildly. Thank you. That's it.
Colin, thank you for an absolutely sparkling talk. And Roger, your response.
Yes, well, thank you for that very interesting survey of almost all the little metaphysical difficulties which philosophers have encountered down the years, not only concerning the relation of God to the world, but also the relation between the mind and the body. And I just might make a few comments because I've got very little to add to what Colin has said. I think that special divine action, as is conceived by people in this conference, is an extremely interesting topic, but of course it does presuppose some sense that God is an agent. And that raises the question of what agency actually is. We had earlier today the discussion in which Bill Russell was trying to put across to us that there may be, thanks to quantum mechanics, elements of indeterminism planted, as it were, in the heart of our universe, and that that is where God's agency can be, as it were, set to work. Things have not been determined at that point, and so God can do what it is that he has to do. And I think most of us found that probably a little bit provocative because of all the difficulties that we already have about the concept of free will. Willem Dries referred to the ideas of Harry Frankfurt, who defines freedom not in terms of indeterminacy, but in terms rather of the second-order desires that people have. The fact that we as self-conscious beings don't merely have the desires that motivate us, but also have desires about those desires and in some way take responsibility for them. And I think, as Colin rightly says, the problem of God's action, when we look at it as it in the round, so to speak, is a special case of the general problem of what action is. And I would just say one thing of my own here. I think that Elizabeth Anscombe made the correct first move in discussing this question generally when she said that in her great book on intention, that the question confronting us is not really about the nature of intentions, it's about the nature of intentional action. What makes an action intentional? And she says, in effect, it's not that it's preceded by some interruption into the stream of causes or any particular kind of mental event. It's that there is a particular question that can be asked of that action, right? That it makes sense to ask of it a certain question, why? She doesn't say enough about what that question is, but I think we can easily elaborate on it, and I would say that what makes an action what makes an action intentional is that it makes sense to hold the individual agent accountable for it. Why did you do that? Where the correct response is not to give a causal explanation, but to attempt a justification and show what it was that you were trying to achieve. And I think that in that sense, we do see the signs of God's agency in the world, in that we're constantly asking this very question of things that happen where we can identify no human agent, but nevertheless we want an answer. Maybe we're wrong to look for that answer, but it makes sense. But as Colin says, that presupposes also that God has a psychology. He rightly says that God must be a person in the sense of being self-conscious, and I would add, being able to provide those reasons for action when addressed. But he has a worry about whether God actually has a personality. This connects with the age-old question of what can we say about God? Does he really have properties that he shares with us? Or is he so unique that nothing can be properly said about him in the language that can be used to describe mortals? Of course, in the Islamic tradition, God is, in certain aspects of it anyway, God has this strange metaphysical status of tawhid, of being just one thing only, so that even to bring him under descriptions and say that he belongs to a certain kind is already to misrepresent his nature. And that's a doctrine that obviously Len Goodman would be able to illuminate for us. So the great question is, what can we say about God which will enable us to answer these general questions of his agency? And are the problems any different from the problems that we have about ourselves. Colin, over the years, has maintained a view which he's made his own, the view of Mysterianism, that somehow that the ability to describe the relation between mind and body and the relation between consciousness and the world also eludes our capacity to describe it. That in some way our mental powers can't stretch this far, because if I understand him rightly, to do so we would have to, as it were, take our consciousness outside our consciousness in order to see exactly how it is that consciousness, as it were, mingles with the substance of the world. And so he adopts this Mysterian position, which about human beings, and I guess would take the same position about God's relation to the world too. But one comfort in this would be the following, that even if it's true that we can't know how it is that the person in us is integrated into the physical object that we confront, even if we can't really grasp this relation, we know that it exists, and we're perfectly familiar with it and can deal with it in our practical day-to-day life through things like Miss Anscombe's question. The question, why are you doing that? So maybe even if God is a mystery to us and moves in a mysterious way, it could be that we can still ask that question of him. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've had a very rich talk and a very enriching response. I suspect we feel slightly underpowered on the stage. You've got one atheist who's shown today already his ignorance of pretty basic stuff. You've got probably a theologically tinged philosopher in Roger, and you've got an excellent philosopher in Colin, but who probably is not a theologian, although I have to say his tour through God's properties left me pretty very impressed, I have to say. So we may well need more help from the auditorium than is normal. So luckily we already have some hands raised, and I have Andrew and I have the lady behind Andrew. So Andrew. Yeah.
Thank you. A wonderful talk, brilliant, embracing. If I may paraphrase, it seems we mustn't cut out God's mind from consideration without cutting off our own heads. But I was just curious to pick up a couple of points you made early on about the nature of God's thinking. And it touched on the question of what you think knowledge is, because you very quickly got into the language of propositions. You may have been written about this elsewhere, and I apologise. But do you think that knowing can be reduced to knowing that without remainder? And the reason I ask this is because we do have, or we had, a science of the psychology of God, not under those terms, several centuries ago. And one of the big things he used to emphasize was that God's thinking was characterized by intellectus and not scientia, the sort of understanding, the sort of thing that Archimedes leaps out of the bar and says, eureka, seeing, not seeing that. So do you have any comments about this in your own view, about whether there's a useful distinction here?
There are lots of distinctions along those lines, different sort of epistemic relations to different things. There's apprehension is usually the relation between mind and an object. In the case of thought, the point I'm making is a pretty trivial one. A thought is always propositional, really by definition, because you always think that P. So when I say if God has thoughts, there must be propositions which are the contents of those thoughts. I'm just, it's another way of saying that if he thinks something, he thinks that P, whatever the P case is. Now there may be other types of knowledge or apprehension in addition to thinking that P or knowing that P. In the case of knowledge, actually, there are, in the literature on knowledge, there are various notions that get analysed. So people analyse X knows that P is the usual one, but then there's also knowing how. There's the idea of knowing a place or knowing a person, right? And then there's knowing an object. Do you know London? You see there are lots of these uses, and I would imagine that these uses of knowledge would apply to God's mind too.
Andrew, do you want to come back on that? Are you content with that?
Well, yes, perhaps a little bit. The case of a baby. A baby knows his or her mother. Does he know that this is his or her mother?
The baby knows its mother. That's the direct object use of know. But if we're talking, you see, about thought, then it's always thinking that P. It's interesting, you see, that with the verb think, it's not like the verb no. There aren't these non-propositional uses of think. See is an interesting case because in that case you've got propositional seeing. I saw that he was in the room, but you've got direct object seeing. I saw him. But in the case of think, you don't seem to have that. But anyway, my general point was really just that God has the kind of thinking which involves propositions because God's reasoning about things, forming, coming to conclusions perhaps, or reasoning practically about things. And if so, then have to be propositional objects just by definition.
Thank you.
Thank you. Divine Psychology 101 was great fun.
Good.
My question is, I found the description, and if you'll excuse the crudeness of both the schema and the analogy, your God was distressingly left-brained. Are there any prominent right-brain features, or is this a half-brained God?
You might want to take legal advice before you answer that.
What's that?
You might want to take legal advice before you answer that question.
I don't know what to say about that.
Actually, Colin, do you want to get a bit nearer the microphone?
Yes, I'm sorry. Are there any prominent right brain thinkers? I'm a prominent right brain thinker. What is left brain?
I think, yes, just to put your question a bit further, you were saying that a lot of the characteristics ascribed to God seemed what are traditionally ascribed to the left hemisphere. So that, I guess...
Well, one of the issues, of course, about God is his disembodiedness. And so any parts of the brain involved in motor activity are not going to be... God won't have a mind involving motor activity if that involves a body. I mean, God does act, so there's going to be something analogous to having a body. There's some way in which God's decisions influence the way things happen. That's, of course, the puzzle of interaction, how that works. I mean, of course, God might be female, too. We don't have to suppose that God's male.
I mean, Roger, God may well have aesthetic experiences, for example. He looked upon the world and saw it was okay.
It's an interesting question whether God has aesthetic experiences.
Yes, he saw that it was good.
He saw that it was good. I think
but
that's reasonable.
I think the Len would, I'm sure, correct me, but the Hebrew word means beautiful too, doesn't it?
It connotes that.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, let's just pursue it for a moment because I mean, he has aesthetic experiences. So, for instance, he would appreciate the beauty of a natural scene. Does he experience aesthetic bliss? That gets a little bit more. Maybe.
We leave that hanging in the air, I guess.
Yeah,
But,
Thank you very much.
We don't know.
I want to try and carry on maybe Andrew Pinson's thought and perhaps even Bethany's thought as well by drawing upon Bernard Lonergan's understanding of Aquinas. So Aquinas has a doctrine of the Trinity, which of course is a mystery, so it's not something that we can know by natural reasoning. But Aquinas thinks that there is a word in God. As you rightly quoted John's Gospel, in the beginning was the word. Aquinas thinks that that cannot be proved by reason, yet he uses a created analogy to get some insight, some imperfect, obscure understanding of this mystery. And what he uses is the psychological analogy which emerges from his epistemology. Now, this is not the sort of epistemology you would get in analytic philosophy, because the analogy of father to son is between the act of understanding, so this is the eureka moment that Andrew is talking about, and the concept. And because Aquinas thinks that we form concept because and from the act of understanding, there is that intimate relation between, on the one hand, the act of understanding and the word. So he thinks that there is a word in God, but he doesn't think that that can be proved by natural reason. I mean, I would hesitate to say that the Father is, if you like, right-brained and the Son, because it's a verbum, is a left-brained, but maybe that's an analogy. And just to finish one more thought, when you understand something and you say it's good, that's the analogy for the procession of the Father to the Spirit. So understand something, it's good. There you've got the Trinity. That's Aquinas' analogy.
Yeah, I mean, the question of, can we prove by reason that God has mastery of a language. We can't prove it, but then we can't prove anything in general about, the problem of other minds. I can't prove you've got a mind. I can't prove it. It's, if we're talking the epistemology of the thing, it's a conjecture. And we use the evidence one uses about God's mind is just based on the tradition. Now, what the epistemology of that tradition is, that's a matter of debate. You might think there's revelation, you might think there are certain privileged people, often called priests, who know more about this than others, or you might take the view that Roger referred to. It's one possible position that we can't say anything strictly about the nature of God, and God is an indescribable being. That would be one view. And I was just talking about, what the orthodox kind of pretty much Judeo-Christian view about God's general nature is, and then making some fairly obvious inferences from, for example, that he thinks and reasons and decides to what else must be true of God. My point about the language, not so much to show that God has language, but if he has language, it's going to have the structure of language. And our best theories of language tell us various things about that structure. Basically, it's a combinatorial system and involves discrete infinity.
Can I just add something? On this question of the divine knowledge, it's not only Aquinas, but quite a lot of philosophers have reflected on the possibility of intuitive knowledge of some kind, in which the subject is directly acquainted with the truth that he apprehends. And Kant, in the Critique of Pure Reason, makes a special place for intuition and says there is this other kind of intuition which is not available to us, intellectual intuition, which is the epistemic posture of God towards the world, in which all truths are apprehended immediately and without the spelling out of the argument for them. And in a way, that is an attempt to move away from the propositional idea of knowledge towards something a bit closer to the knowledge by acquaintance sort of thing. So I think it does seem that a full theology or a full account of God's psychology would have to have a lot to say about that kind of knowledge.
Gentleman in the blue shirts.
Thank you. Divine immutability used to be part of orthodoxy, but it seems to me it's not anymore a part of orthodoxy. So if we drop divine immutability and we can talk about, for example, love in any analogical sense to human love, I don't see why not saying that God is long-suffering or other personality traits would fit as well, theologically speaking, even though they may seem like more anthropomorphic. But in a sense, all personality traits or human traits are,
you're talking here about things like emotions. I don't deny that God has emotions. I think God does have emotions. Now, you said personality traits. That's fine, those are personality traits, but to have a personality is a different question, isn't it? Having personality traits is not the same as having a personality. I'm talking, you see, about personality in the way psychologists talk about it. And they have these things called personality tests. And it's usually about introversion and extroversion. And there's a couple of other dimensions that they talk about. That's what seems inappropriate to the case of God. That's what doesn't seem to be so. But God has traits of personality, such as hope, love, and so on.
The God of the Old Testament has a serious personality disorder, doesn't he? And let's face it.
That sounds a bit like Richard. That sounds a bit about Richard Dawkins saying you should go to an anger management class, doesn't it? But
and that's the view that's been moved away from in theology because it's too anthropomorphic.
Yes. Yeah.
It's too much modelling God on us, and people have realised that it's a very limiting view. One God has a personality with these kinds of vices, and so that's the theological views have purged our conception of God of that type of thing, while keeping things like love.
We better draw a veil over that, lest we're struck by lightning. But I've got three people in a row. I think there's a gentleman there, and then Len. So can you work our way across? Is that all? Sort of there. Thank you.
Yeah, so Colin, this is Jason from Ryerson University in Toronto. Thank you for that insightful paper. I wanted to ask something about your Mysterianism view. I wonder, first of all, according to the Mysterian view, you do believe that the mind is distinct from the body? Is that correct?
Well, that way of putting it is very simple.
Okay, but just that it's...
In that putting it, I'd say no, it's not
Oh.
distinct from the body. No.
But there is some interaction.
There's distinctness and distinctness. There's one way to take that is something like Cartesian dualism. Another way is just say property dualism or dual aspect theory. My overall metaphysical position, as I've been saying to a couple of people, is pluralism rather than dualism.
Okay.
So I think there are many properties of persons, what we call persons, which are irreducible to each other and different. Some of them are aesthetic, some are moral, some are mental in some sense they're mental and others, some are physical in some sense they're physical. So, and they're all distinct from each other in the sense that you can't reduce one to the other. But they're not distinct from each other in the sense that one could exist without the other, or Descartes' picture where you could have a mind existing in a completely disembodied form.
I see.
Not distinct in that sense.
Okay, so then I guess my question is maybe whatever has led you to believe that, I wonder if that could apply. I wonder if you think there's anything in the world that might be distinct, or signs in the world that might lead one to think that there's this divine substance, that there's this divine thing that can't be explained, can't be reduced to the material world. I just wonder if there's something that you might find out.
I'm, of course, I'm an atheist, but so I'm talking about a tradition, and I'm trying to be neutral on the question.
Yeah.
So of course, if you ask me, do I think there's anything in the world which provides evidence of the existence of God? I don't think so. But that's another debate altogether. But no, I don't think there's any reason to believe in God. But that's the position that I hold. But I wasn't trying to, of course, to defend that view.
No.
I'm really and I don't even like describing myself as an atheist, because it suggests that somehow I think about it a lot. I wake up in the morning and reaffirm it in my bosom. And I just don't. I call myself a post-atheist.
Right.
And if you, what I mean by that, all of us in this room, all of you really more than me, are all post-polytheists.
Yeah.
Nobody wakes up each morning and says, I reject polytheism. You put it behind you. It's not an issue for you, is it? The issue of polytheism. It used to be. I mean, there was a time when it was a big issue about polytheism versus monotheism. So when I say I'm a post-atheist, I mean in that sense in which you're all apolytheists.
Yeah.
But not because you actively are thinking about your rejection of polytheism. It's just not an issue for you anymore.
Right. Yeah. So my question was mainly just if there was anything about the Mysterianism of the mind and body that might apply to God in the world.
No.
Okay. Thank you.
No.
Thank you. Just further along the road there.
Hi, Joel Hubick from K11. I have a comment and a question. My comment is I'd just like to say thank you, and I appreciated this talk, specifically because it presented questions as opposed to a detailed argument for an answer. And my question follows that on this view you have of Mysterianism. So I'm curious if I agree with you, or if I'm convinced of this position, that a certain notion or problem fits this description of mysterious quality. Is that an answer that keeps me from asking this question, what it is, again? Or is it rather an answer that preserves the question and makes me continually ask it again and again? And then if it is the latter, is there still a possibility that something that is currently believed to be a mystery, or in the nuanced way you're presenting it, could it someday be resolved? Is there still a possibility that it could be answered?
Yeah. I believe in degrees or grades of mystery. And so there are certain conditions under which what are currently mysteries might cease to be mysteries. So, for instance, talk about my general view, not what I talked about today, but there was a time when the biological world on planet Earth contained a very large number of mysteries. In fact, almost everything was a mystery to the species that then existed. Let's go back, say 1 million years would be a reasonable thing. Then everything was a mystery to all the species. And then the brain, changed as mammals came along and primates came along, and eventually the human brain developed its frontal lobes, and of course we had many earlier hominid species, probably about 27 as my last reading of this, Neanderthals and many others. No doubt their brains were not quite as sophisticated as ours, so there were more mysteries for them than there are for us. They probably were very poor at science, they probably had not very good organizational, social organizational abilities. So we've reached a certain point where our brains are at a certain degree of sophistication, and so some things are not mysteries for us anymore, and some things are. Now, if you just go into the future, let's go 1 million years from now, and the brains of our successor species might be different from ours, or so maybe then things which are mysteries for us would not be mysteries for them. I mean, when I've written about this in the past, I like to make the analogy with Martians whose brains I imagine would be in the thought experiment are very different from ours, and they find it very puzzling that we find the mind-body problem puzzling, or free will, or any other philosophical problem. That's it. They say, oh, why is that so troublesome? And we say, well, and they say, oh, no, it's very simple. And then they start saying things we just can't understand. And so we feel inferior, then we start saying to them, so, what about, I take it you're quite good, though, at understanding now about basic physics, and they demonstrate they don't understand the first thing about it. An inversion, you see, of mysteries. So that's why I'm a naturalistic Mysterian. It's very much dependent on the idea of limitations of human knowledge, human understanding, which result from just contingent facts about human understanding. So that's why I think of us as humans. We don't think any other species could know the answer to philosophical problems, but we seem quite confident about ourselves. That's the kind of background epistemology that I use. So this is partly why, in response to the previous question when I said about the mystery, see, it's a naturalistic Mysterianism because I'm not supposing there's any ontological implication of something being a mystery. It's a purely an epistemic fact about what kind of intellect or intelligence a given organism has. So one of the arguments I've made about this is that consciousness actually is probably not a very complicated thing, objectively, because consciousness exists in all sorts of species to a very low level, including, I think, insects. So what I mean by consciousness is just having sensations. I'm not meaning self-consciousness. So it doesn't take a very, very complicated brain to have visual sensations, but I think there's an equal problem about the mind of an insect and the brain of an insect. So there's a mismatch, you see, between what's difficult for us, which is an epistemological question, and what's ontologically, whatever word we're going to use, complex, difficult. I'm pulling those two things apart.
Okay, Goodman.
Let me take exception, first of all, to the personality disorder remark. We've been skirting literalism, and it's very easy polemically to take advantage of overly literal accounts of biblical language or other language that might crudely be held, and to use them polemically. The Bible likes to use a lot of poetic expressions about God. That's a very natural thing for it to do, since we need to talk indirectly about something that we don't know directly. So when the marital metaphor is used and the exclusivity of God's relationship with Israel is represented in terms of emotions like jealousy as a metaphor for the exclusivity of the relationship, exclusivity being a double kind of abstraction which the Bible continuously avoids. We shouldn't go psychologizing quite so much. I wanted to pick up on what both Andrew and Roger were saying when I think both of them, and I felt what I suspect was the same feeling they did about the assumption that divine knowledge must be propositional.
I never made that assumption.
Okay.
I was talking about thinking. God has thoughts. I actually didn't say anything about divine knowledge at all.
Okay.
In response to the question,
Yeah, divine thought must be discursive, if you prefer to put it that way. I think it was right to refer to, as Roger did, to Kant's idea about rational intuitions. We have an inkling of those when we intuit the truth of a mathematical axiom or other very basic relationships,
Sure.
that if A is bigger than B, then...
I was never maintaining that God's cognitive faculties are always propositional. I'm saying God has thoughts, and in the sense in which he thinks that so-and-so.
Okay.
And so if he does, then it follows trivially from that.
Let me couch it not as a criticism of what you were saying, but just as an assertion on my own part. I think that it's a mistake to regard divine thinking as necessarily discursive. There's a lot of tradition which looks at the matter in a more Platonic way. That's what Kant was wanting to connect with, or that's what Andrew was referring to, and I think likely, quite rightly, there's two other factors beyond the timelessness that kind of knowledge would involve, which I think are worth noticing. One is that divine knowledge, if God is omniscient, would have none of the psychological foregrounding or backgrounding that we're used to in our knowledge. I think you did allude to that, because God's knowledge, if we can think of it at all, would involve sort of all the ideas being present at once, which is not something that we can wrap our minds around. But the third point is a classical one, and it's a point that's made by Maimonides, that truth in our knowledge is obtained by studying a thing and working it out a posteriori, as he gives the example of figuring out how a water clock works by taking it apart and following the motions of each part and so forth. Truth is the correspondence of our ideas to the reality, whereas Maimonides and Aquinas says something similar. In that regard, truth is the correspondence of the object to God's idea. The thing sort of has to live up to what it might be as God conceives it. I think that those three examples, and I'm sure that there are many more that I don't know, are indicative of what the Bible means when the prophet says, in God's name, my thoughts are not like your thoughts. They're as high as the heavens are from the earth. That's how different my thinking is from your thinking. So it's very, very difficult for us to try to think our way into divine thinking. And when people do so, we have to allow them to use poetry to try to reach for what I think you and I would agree may be in itself unreachable.
Quick response to that, Roger.
Yes, I agree with entirely what Len's just said. But I think we do have models of other kinds of knowledge which are not just mathematical. Obviously, Spinoza had this idea that with his different levels of truth, so to speak, that the ultimate truth of everything is how that thing is represented in the mind of God. In other words, in terms of all its logical connections to the whole of discourse, so to speak. But I think we do have forms of knowledge which I think are quite good models for some of the knowledge that God has of us. For instance, I think anybody who loves the late Beethoven quartets has a sense of being presented directly with a state of mind through them, which couldn't be put into words, but is there in the music, and is not available in any other way, but it's there immediately. And it's not just a feeling in me, it's the mind before me, or the mind that I'm listening to. And that, I think, does give us a kind of model for the way in which God can relate to each of us personally. And I think that that's why I think the aesthetic is much more important than it might look at first sight, because it is a paradigm for us of how we come to know the world through intuition without translating it into discursive thought. And maybe that is only the beautiful story of Genesis, where God actually makes the world and then, for the first time, stands back and has the full aesthetic experience. You know, then he knew the meaning of it.
Yes.
And we were part of it.
Well, I think that's a lovely note to end. I'd just throw in one thought, is whether God's thoughts are token thoughts that occur in time, or thought types that have location eternity. I guess that's something for another day. But I think it was Humphrey Lyttelton who used to say towards the end of the, sorry I haven't a clue, he said, "I hear the tortoise of time about to explode in the microwave of eternity." And what he was saying, what he was essentially saying is, we've pretty well come to the end. I can't see any further questions. And I think we've had a fantastically, really enriching presentation, and your response to the presentation is a measure of how enriching it has been. So thanks particularly to Colin and also to Roger.